Ahead and come on camera. Hi Dawn, it's so great to see
Hi,
you.
Bridget.
I wish I was in person, but it's so wonderful to see you. And I'm gonna just do some quick virtual housekeeping items, and then I'll invite Dawn, who's one of our new guests in the last part of this series, to introduce herself. I know we have about 150 folks that have registered, and it doesn't look like we quite have critical mass yet, but Dawn and I are committed to keeping you to an hour. So we're going to jump in with some of the housekeeping items and introductions. Once again, I do want to point out that this session is being recorded, as you just heard, for future use, and making this information accessible to folks doing this really important work supporting survivors of trauma through the legal system. Also, for accessibility, closed captions are available, and there is the ability to use that function through Zoom. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat, and we're happy to help folks behind the scenes. Again, to those who have rolled in, welcome. We at Network for Victim Recovery of DC are very excited to bring you today's training in partnership with the National Women's Law Center's Legal Network for Gender Equity team. And today I am joined by a very longtime partner and champion for survivors of civil justice, Dawn Jackson of Jackson and Associates. Dawn and I are really looking forward to the last discussion in this three-part series that will really cover from a broad view tips for holistic trauma-informed representation. We're going to build on some of the high-level suggestions that we've already talked about in the other two parts of this series, but also dive a little deeper on those tools and strategies to minimize trauma impacts as the legal team may be preparing clients with trauma histories around general, more broadly litigation techniques and phases of the litigation process. So thanks to those of you who are here. It looks like we have about 35 folks. For those who have joined, we have the chat function pulled up as a way to engage with you throughout the training today. I do want to ask, because I know we had in the folks that joined for part two, there was quite an overlap of those that came to part one. If you can just put in the chat, as long as you're comfortable, kind of 3 of 3, if you came to all 3 parts of this series, if you've been here the whole time, or 1 of 3, 2 of 3, if this is your first, let us know. That's really helpful. Just so that we get a sense of who has had some of those. Yay, 3 for 3, Arlene, you're just making my whole day. Kevin, I'm so excited. That's first timer. James got a first timer here. It's just great to see who has had some of those foundational conversations that we've already had. And again, for those that have been to a prior part, if you have like a key takeaway or just like a nugget that really stuck with you as we talked about Trauma 101, as we talked about trauma-informed interview skills, really would love to know any key takeaways. Katie, thanks for being 3 of 3 there, just getting some of these chats rolling in. Any nuggets are really helpful as we think about continuing to make this information accessible. What really stood out to you as a helpful tool? And with that, I'll talk a little bit about me for the first timers, but more importantly, I'm so excited to be joined by our guest, Dawn Jackson, who's really just a hero of mine and the work that she does to support survivors and represent clients with trauma histories. Dawn, please feel free to introduce yourself, talk about your firm and the important work you do supporting clients with trauma histories.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Dawn Jackson. I am the founder of Jackson and Associates Law Firm. We strive to provide victims of crime the best civil litigation and civil remedies possible in the District of Columbia. First of all, I apologize. My daughter runs track and I've been screaming like a mad woman at her races. So if you can understand me, I'll try to speak slowly because my voice is so hoarse. What we do is most victims believe that the criminal justice system is the end to all, but it's not. Most victims that we come across need some type of civil remedy to help them with therapy, to help them recover lost wages, to actually get them back to where they should have been if the incident or the crime didn't take place. And that's what we try to do, is we try to help the victims recover so they can live their lives as happily as they should have had if this crime had never taken place. And that's what we strive to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawn. I've just seen firsthand the way you've transformed survivors' lives. I know in my work, it can be so challenging to find civil litigation partners that really understand the complexity of how trauma shows up in clients' lives. And so you all are in for a real treat to have Dawn to really add to the conversation that we're going to be having today. And again, we are grateful for those of you who were able to join us. And if you're a first timer, that's great too. I want to announce that you can receive CLE credit, and you should have received from a prior link that came via email information about how to obtain the CLEs. That also included the materials for today's webinar. Jessica, who is behind the scenes helping me out today, thanks so much, Jessica, shout out to you, is going to put in the chat the link that contains the CLE materials. That's the slides, the bios, supplemental articles, information in the agenda for the day, so you have a little roadmap. I also want to announce that if you are here for CLE credit, after the event, in that link, you will find two forms, the evaluation and the attorney affirmation form. Those are available, and you should send those back to Jessica Sanchez. Her email is jsanchez@hsgllp.com. Jessica's also, our Jessica is going to put Jessica Sanchez's email in the chat there, so you have it. And please take note that we are going to, throughout today's training, announce one code for CLE credit. That's how you will be able to verify your attendance for today. So be on the lookout. When I announce that, Jessica will also put it in the chat. And so I'm seeing the information roll in. Watch the chat for anything that you need, and Jessica will be following along to share additional information in our presentation today. If you've been with us before, you know I'm going to give the disclaimer on language, content, and short and long-term support. We do use the term victim and survivor interchangeably, just like Dawn talked about. In certain legal contexts, victim is a legal term of art that someone needs to meet the definition of to have legal standing. But we often refer to our clients as survivors or mere whatever language makes them feel comfortable. You'll hear us use those references today. Some of the examples that I'm going to use can be really challenging to hear about. And so we're in this virtual space so that you all can take care of yourselves to make sure you access the information, but feel free to step away, reach out if you need additional support. We're not just here for today. We really want to be an available resource as you do important work supporting survivors in your communities. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for your time and attention as we move into discussing the third in this three-part series. As a reminder, for those who weren't able to attend, we started off in part one with Trauma 101, really thinking about how to understand trauma impacts, supports to help clients with trauma histories. And then we moved into part two of this series. And that one looked a little bit more specifically in our communication strategies with clients. How can we create trauma-informed interviews and intakes in using this more holistic trauma-informed practice? And I think for today, not only do I want to join those who are closing out the final part of the series with us, I did want to share that at the end of today, we are going to leave our contact information, and Jessica will share a link to our organization at NVRDC. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have more questions or just want to talk more. Today happens to be a really exciting day in our organizational history. We're launching our National Trauma Education Project, which is just more information that builds on what you've already learned. You can reach out if you want to learn more about that. We also launched our Trauma Ties podcast that talks about how we are all connected in the shared experience and how we can find a common language to connect us in understanding and supporting those who have had trauma exposure. So with today, I'm excited to go ahead and jump into the discussion we're going to be having. And we're going to, again, have three specific objectives that we'll be looking at. We'll start off just with that broader kind of macro framework of what are the hallmarks of trauma-informed litigation strategies and practices. We will look specifically at tools that encourage building a trusted, thoughtful attorney-client relationship, navigating the attorney-client relationship, knowing now the challenges and how trauma can manifest and present. And then also, we want to build resiliency in folks that are doing this work. So for the first time, we're going to talk about taking care of you, not just how you take care of your clients. And I'm really excited to have that discussion with you all. We'll launch into the hallmarks here. Again, this is kind of just a high level. We did in the resource packet include an article, The Pedagogy of Trauma-Informed Lawyering. It's super helpful and is really a great resource that outlines some of the trauma-informed practices and the principles of creating a trauma-informed practice. We have here kind of 5 of these principles that we want to really highlight and uplift for folks. Thank you, Jessica, for putting the article there in the chat. We know that a trauma-informed practice approach does require, usually in the research, you see 4 of these things. We've added the second one. But first, and this was really the grounding of part 1 of the training, we want to identify how trauma presents, just simply knowing how to recognize it when we see it. And that is a really great way to be a more effective attorney. Arguably, an attorney's ability is to communicate with clients and to develop that trusted relationship. We've talked a little bit about the neuroscience of trust. And as a lawyer, that means doing what is expected of us and how we create what that expectation is with our client, using power with them, not power over them. An attorney does not need to be, as you've learned, a mental health expert to recognize when trauma is presenting in our clients. We can understand through their behaviors that we've talked about something that could be a trauma manifestation where we might be the trauma cue, putting them back into that moment where they feel a potential threat. So this is just kind of one of the big takeaways, is do what you've been doing, which is learn how to recognize and identify how trauma can present. Second here, we really want to prepare for those trauma cues. And one of the examples I always talk about, whether that's in the intake or the legal interview, is the glassy eyes, right? We know for trauma survivors that often have a freeze response to their trauma exposure, or even a flight response when they feel threatened or reminded of that 10 to 20% overlap of threat that they've already experienced. When they're having communication with us, we might start to see the glassy eyes. We might start to see them looking at the door. And when we see those cues, we need to know what can we do in response to minimize the cue, the reminder that I am causing of that trauma event. It's really about getting them out of their limbic system and back into the frontal lobe, right? Back into logical processing. We've talked in the prior strategies around water. How can we organically and naturally regulate that activation of the autonomic nervous system? But I want to give you a story to highlight another strategy that can be really helpful in preparing clients for trauma cues that when you're working specifically with trauma survivors, you can just expect. You can expect that part of your relationship is going to be reminding them of the harmful events that they've experienced. And so I'm thinking about a specific case where I represented a woman whose husband had been murdered. And he was murdered on the same day that another woman was murdered by her husband. He shot her more than 20 times in front of their family home, and her 3 boys came home to find their mom murdered that day. This was a devastating day for that family, for those 3 boys. It was their father that had killed their mother. And then that same man drove to a barber shop in a small place locally where we are, and killed a man who was the husband of my client. It was just a tragic day where 6 kids lost their parents that day. And this was an interesting and complex case in that the man who committed these 2 murders was ultimately prosecuted, but he, after this happened, tried to kill himself and jumped in front of a metro train, which is our subway if you're in New York. That's what we call it here in the region. He survived that. He was life flighted and went through a series of surgeries in which he survived and lost both of his legs, and had made a series of confessions in that process. And this is all public information. This case became very well known in the region, and ultimately he was prosecuted for both of those murders. And I think what stands out to me is I met the grandparents who were raising the 3 boys that lost their mom that day. About 3 years later, because the case was really held up on this sort of pretrial issue of would these confessions be allowed in as evidence. And when I met the grandparents, I developed this really strong relationship with them. This was their only child that they had lost, and they were retired. They didn't expect to be raising 3 teenage boys. And what I found in the years that followed is that right around November, I would often start to hear from them. And I would get phone calls where I was interpreting an activation, a trauma response, right? The reminder of that loss, the grief was very present for them. And it took me a minute to realize that it was the holidays, it was the proximity to the holidays that was the reminder that they had to face, that they had, been raising 3 boys and their daughter was gone, and the holidays were a really important time for this family. And what I realized is that if I could get in front of that cue, if I could send them a card in early November, if I could reach out, send an email, I actually had the ability to minimize that response. They had less activated responses when I honored and acknowledged that this was a hard time and a loss that they were holding. And so we're not going to be able to do that for every client. But why number 2 was so important for me to add in terms of the larger trauma-informed practice approach is that we can, when we start to understand what those trauma reminders and cues are, we can get in front of them to potentially minimize them. I think in addition to that, it's really important that we understand how we can actually ask for permission to adjust the attorney-client relationship when we recognize that something we're doing is just not working because of that person's trauma history. Once we recognize that, in the attorney-client relationship, if we want it to be as strong as possible, we realize that trauma can affect our ability, not only because of trauma and memory, to get a client's whole story, right? The pieces that they attach shame and blame to. And what we can do is when we recognize there's a particularly hard part of the client's narrative to talk about, we can name it, we can acknowledge it, and we can actually develop a plan for them of what is going to make them feel safest to share that information in a way that they're prepared for the response, the trauma cue that could ultimately come of talking about often the most horrific day or loss of their lives. And so cultivating these strategies makes attorneys not only more effective, but it actually enhances our ability to build a more trusted attorney-client relationship. Fourth here is actually knowing how to adapt our litigation strategy, the client's trauma and their experience. It does often mean that we have to shift, bringing in certain experts that talk about counterintuitive behaviors that we were not prepared to have to bring in, educating judges and juries, law students, right? Future lawyers. How do we think broadly about strategies within the legal context so that we are educating people out of the assumptions they make about someone's story changing equals no credibility or deceit? We know now that that's just not true, that outside of 2 sleep cycles, trauma memories are more likely to evolve and change and become more linear because they're recalled in a very, very different way. I think lastly here, and then I'll invite Dawn, you to add anything that you want to these kind of high level principles. We want to prevent vicarious trauma. We often in the legal profession call this compassion fatigue. One of the most important things one of my legal directors has always said is, look, it's like being on an airplane. We put our mask on first so we can help everyone around us. And that is true for lawyers, legal, professionals, paraprofessionals supporting people with trauma histories. If you are not taking care of yourself in this work, you cannot show up at your full best self and help others that really rely on us to do really great, important, hard work. And so we'll talk a little bit about what does that look like within the individual level? What does that maybe even look like broader as an organization? But from this kind of macro lens, Dawn, anything you would add in terms of that adjustment of the legal strategy or the relationship that you think is really important to highlight?
Absolutely. After dealing with victims for over 20 years, the one thing that I always suggest to all of the victims is to get some type of therapy. The therapy actually works with us because they're able to vent where we're not capable of giving them advice or telling them coping mechanisms because we're lawyers. The therapist actually guides them and helps them through the litigation process. So I've had clients that have not had therapy and the ones that did. And the ones that did, it was actually a very smoother transition into the litigation process. What I would do with my clients is give them a list of things that we're going to cover so they could be prepared for depositions. They could have the therapist give them coping mechanisms to deal with these stressful times. Trial, depositions, it's all triggered. It triggers them, and you will have the best client in a prep for a deposition. But when it came to trial or the deposition, they just can't because they're being pressured. It's not the same as when you have opposing counsel drilling them, making them feel like they're not a victim or a survivor, but they've done something wrong. So what I would add to that, Bridget, is that make sure that your clients seek mental help or therapy, whatever it needs to get through the litigation process.
It's such an important point, Dawn, because I think about how, particularly those of us in the space that want to be helpers, like part of being trauma responsive is recognizing that we can't do all things that our clients need, and knowing those other support structures that are going to really dig into preparation of the trauma cues, the coping strategies, how have they built resiliency in other aspects of their life, and how can we channel those same strategies into what they're coping with now. Ultimately, what I really hear you putting a fine point on, right, is the idea that trauma-informed practice requires that we are being client-centered and thinking about all of the ways that their life is being impacted by what ultimately has been sort of zoned into a legal goal. And we do know that there are kind of these four central themes of being client-centered. One, we really draw attention to the critical importance of the non-legal aspects that Dawn's talking about, like support, peer support, therapy support groups, coping strategies. We also think about the lawyer's role in representation within the limits that we have. Being boundary setting is actually healthy. Being clear about what we can and can't do to support clients is being client-centered. And that's kind of counterintuitive in how we think about being clear about time boundaries. Like, those are helpful things for clients to know. We only have 30 minutes, right? That's a helpful thing to front load and do expectation management. Also, I think being client-centered really insists on this idea that the client is the decision maker, and we certainly are going to give them advice and information about the consequences of decisions, but we're really allowing them to share power in that decision-making process, which is hard because this is not how we're taught as lawyers. We're taught to have all the answers and know how to move forward, and being trauma-informed really means moving in step with the client as they fully understand the consequences of those decisions. And it really places high value on us understanding our clients' perspectives, their emotions, their values. It's harder to be someone who is client-centered because it takes a lot more intentionality and time. And this is where I sort of like to highlight that being trauma responsive in broader litigation strategies, just like Dawn is saying, like get them prepared for the deposition process, for cross, for all the ways that they're going to be interacting with someone who may not care as much about their values and their goals, right? Well, what that means is that on the left here, we're taking into account their entire lived experience, all of their identities, what's important to them, how that's impacting their experience with us. All of who they are actually matters when we're being trauma responsive. And then, on the right side here, this is actually from a more recent article that I was just finding really fascinating. It was looking at some of the ways that we can address complex trauma, often what results in PTS, although of course PTS can be one trauma exposure. It doesn't have to mean that it's been chronic trauma. But you see here what the scans found about brain activity for someone who sort of has been diagnosed with PTS versus someone who hasn't. And it's really interesting. The study was led by NCPTSD and a Yale psychologist. And it was really one of the first to look at a specific alteration that you can see here in the brain scans that happens related to glutamate, that really is a signaling of a certain hormone within our brain and how it changes after we've had a PTS diagnosis. What was fascinating to me about this study is that it actually found in animals, when they had this brain pattern from that glutamate, I'm sounding super nerdy right now, but that they found this overstimulation of that hormone was actually associated with exaggerated fear and stress-related behaviors. So think about what we learned when we had that foundational understanding of the difference between stress and trauma. We all get stressed, right? But we have this window of tolerance that we can hover in and out of to cope with that stress. We know trauma is getting pushed outside of that window of tolerance. What this actually is showing us is that the more trauma we experience, the window of tolerance of the kinds of stress we can experience gets smaller, right, than it used to be. And so interacting with systems, with structures, with people that are not as client-centered, are not as empathetic, actually becomes harder when you're a trauma survivor. And I think that's an important piece of seeing the full picture of the conversation that we've been having together. And this is really bore out in the research. There was this interesting study, and it was actually based on folks who were military veterans. That's one of the first places where we started understanding the neuroscience of trauma. But in this specific study, they did brain scans of individuals who had self-disclosed chronic trauma histories. They compared them with individuals who had not self-identified as having chronic trauma exposure. So what this means is frequent release of cortisol in the limbic system, activating our stress response, all of what we've learned about what flows from that. What they found is that when someone experiences more frequent release of those stress hormones, signaling that they're in threat, they need to respond, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The more that happens in these brain scans, the folks that had that had an 8% smaller hippocampus. Why does any of this matter? Well, the hippocampus is the part of the brain that is involved in recalling traumatic memories, right? It's different than thinking about what I had for breakfast today or what I ate yesterday. Trauma recall is different. Trauma recall, when we're stressed, is also different. And so when we think about the fact that we are seeing in the science, chronic trauma causes physiological injury to the brain. It actually shrinks the part of the brain that is involved in trauma memories. We start to think about trauma more like a physical injury. And so I often think about like a broken leg. If I were to have a broken leg, we all would generally accept that I can't just get up and walk normal. We would say, well, Bridget, you need treatment, you need a plan, maybe you need some sort of medical intervention, and eventually over time, you'll be able to walk normal again. Trauma is the same kind of injury in the brain. And just like Dawn is saying, we need a treatment plan. We need coping strategies, tools, resources, so that injury can heal over time. And expecting someone who's had a trauma exposure to just get up and walk normal without planning, treatment, and support is not going to be physically possible. And this study is really helpful for folks who maybe have a harder time buying in to that reality. And so I do talk a lot in our training about the difference between stress and memory. I'm going to play a quick little video here, and then we're going to talk about why this is relevant.
You spend weeks studying for an important test. On the big day, you wait nervously as your teacher hands it out. You're working your way through when you're asked to define ataraxia. You know you've seen it before, but your mind goes blank. What just happened? The answer lies in the complex relationship between stress and memory. There are many types and degrees of stress and different kinds of memory, but we're going to focus on how short-term stress impacts your memory for facts. To start, it helps to understand how this kind of memory works. Facts you read, hear, or study become memories through a process with three main steps. First comes acquisition, the moment you encounter a new piece of information. Each sensory experience activates a unique set of brain areas. In order to become lasting memories, these sensory experiences have to be consolidated by the hippocampus, influenced by the amygdala, which emphasizes experiences associated with strong emotions. The hippocampus then encodes memories, probably by strengthening the synaptic connections stimulated during the original sensory experience. Once a memory has been encoded, it can be remembered or retrieved later. Memories are stored all over the brain, and it's likely the prefrontal cortex that signals for their retrieval. So how does stress affect each of these stages? In the first two stages, moderate stress can actually help experiences enter your memory. Your brain responds to stressful stimuli by releasing hormones known as corticosteroids, which activate a process of threat detection and threat response in the amygdala. The amygdala prompts your hippocampus to consolidate the stress-inducing experience into a memory. Meanwhile, the flood of corticosteroids from stress stimulates your hippocampus, also prompting memory consolidation. But even though some stress can be helpful, extreme and chronic stress can have the opposite effect. Researchers have tested this by injecting rats directly with stress hormones. As they gradually increased the dose of corticosteroids, the rats' performance on memory tests increased at first, but dropped off at higher doses. In humans, we see a similar positive effect with moderate stress, but that only appears when the stress is related to the memory task. So while time pressure might help you memorize a list, having a friend scare you will not. And the weeks, months, or even years of sustained corticosteroids that result from chronic stress can damage the hippocampus and decrease your ability to form new memories. It would be nice if some stress also helped us remember facts, But unfortunately, the opposite is true. The act of remembering relies on the prefrontal cortex, which governs thought, attention, and reasoning. When corticosteroids stimulate the amygdala inhibits or lessens the activity of the prefrontal cortex. The reason for this inhibition is so the fight, flight, freeze response can overrule slower, more reasoned thought in a dangerous situation. But that can also have the unfortunate effect of making your mind go blank during a test. And then the act of trying to remember can itself be a stressor, leading to a vicious cycle of more corticosteroid release and an even smaller chance of remembering. So what can you do to turn stress to your advantage and stay calm and collected when it matters the most? First, if you know a stressful situation like a test is coming, try preparing in conditions similar to the stressful environment. Novelty can be a stressor. Completing practice questions under time pressure, or seated at a desk rather than on a couch, can make your stress response to these circumstances less sensitive during the test itself. Exercise is another useful tool. Increasing your heart and breathing rate is linked to chemical changes in your brain that help reduce anxiety and increase your sense of well-being. Regular exercise is also widely thought to improve sleeping patterns, which comes in handy the night before a test. And on the actual test day, try taking deep breaths to counteract your body's fight, flight, freeze response. Deep breathing exercises have shown measurable reduction in test anxiety in groups ranging from third graders to nursing students. So the next time you find your mind going blank at a critical moment, take a few deep breaths until you remember ataraxia, a state of calmness, free from anxiety. Check out these videos to
So that's a lot to take in. But what I love about that video is not only does it really put a fine point on what we've been talking about, that trauma recall is not the same as everyday memories, even everyday memories that might have moderate stress in the sort of recall process. For me, a couple of things stand out. One, it really highlights that we now understand the more of the cortisol, the stress hormone that gets released, we see damage, shrinking of the hippocampus, which is involved in memory recall, particularly from trauma memories. I think also something comes up for me that happened, gosh, it was like 5 years ago now, right around this time of year. I got a call from my partner. Our house had been broken into. It was the middle of the day, and they had taken a bunch of my checks and bank information. And he's like, you got to call the bank and you got to cancel your accounts. And so, we had 2 baby kittens. This was the most important thing to me. It's are the cats okay? And we couldn't find one. And I was going home and I was so worried. We found her. She usually shows up to bother us on these trainings. But at the time I was very stressed, and I call the bank and they're asking me the number one thing a bank is always going to call you when you're calling. And they're like, what's your social security number? I have known this number more, it is the longest thing I can remember memorizing. It was the very first thing I remember memorizing to my memory bank. I could not remember it. And this was just stress, right? It was impacting my ability to recall a fact that I knew but couldn't get to. So compound that with you're going through a stressful situation, which is the court process, whether that's being actually on the witness stand, whether that's being cross-examined, more stressful. That in itself is going to create recall challenges. You couple that with someone who has a trauma history, whether that's events or circumstances of their life, right? Generational trauma, and think about the best thing we know to prepare them for that is practice. It's the things that you saw in the video, like Dawn talked about. Build the coping strategies, prepare for that stress, practice it, know what's coming. And then it's also the grounding. You're going to get activated in that moment when you're being asked very concrete details that are a reminder of that event. How do we practice breathing strategies, getting back into the frontal lobe, getting that logical part of the brain back online? I love that video.
Can I chime in just a little bit?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so as a practicing attorney, when we get victims that come into our office, we give them a questionnaire about what happened. Give us the details. What's the police report number? 9 times out of 10, those forms are blank. Once I pick up the phone and call the client and we talk about this in a very normal, safe conversation, I'm able to fill in the blanks. And what I've done as dealing with victims is that we fill in the blanks as we go along. So by the time we get to the deposition or by the time we get to the trial, they have an idea of the things that they've forgotten. But when you walk into a lawyer's office, you're scared. You don't know if someone's judging you, like you caused this. You're not a victim. You don't know how people are viewing you. So you're scared to actually fill out a questionnaire. And I've realized that over the years that I have to be more involved in that process in order to get the information to sort of get them to jog their memory. So thank you for that. Yes.
It's such a good point. And I've been talking a lot about oxytocin. So it's the hormone that's created that we're now starting to understand helps build trust. It's also the hormone when we experience love and joy, but that oxytocin comes from exactly what you're describing, Dawn. Moments in constant interactions where I am being a trusted person in that individual's life and experience, right? And that takes time. That's not going to probably be the first conversation. And so I love that you're like highlighting that. And this is a great place too for you to jump in. We've talked about some of these general grounding strategies. We've talked about the value of creating opportunities for choice to have those small moments of building trust over time. I'm curious in terms of litigation preparation. I'll often get folks sort of ask the question, you know, I've learned that asking someone to share their narrative lots of times is actually not helpful. How do I balance that with the time-bound pressures of preparing them for depositions, for cross? And my answer, Dawn, I'm really curious what you would add to some of these strategies here is we ask, right? Because while we have been taught over the last 6 years, like telling a narrative multiple times is not trauma-informed, what we know is that some survivors actually really like the ability to storytell, and that can be really cathartic and healing. And we make a lot of assumptions about what is the best practice when what we actually know about being trauma responsive is we use it as an opportunity to ask that individual, do you want to talk this through? Do you want me to ask questions during, after? How do you balance sort of some of those things we've been taught, Dawn, about what is trauma-informed litigation with kind of how you deal with it in practice?
Well, we're put in a bad situation from the start. We have to talk about the bad things, and we have to because that's what we're doing. We're litigating on behalf of them, trying to help them, but at the same time, we feel sort of like a villain because we're making them relive everything. We're actually bringing stuff out that has nothing to do with the incident at hand, because we have to know your past, we have to know what got you here, we have to know your mental state. So we have to work with gloves with dealing with our clients. And that's where I found out the therapists really helped me because they're able to share or say, hey, my attorney wants to do deposition prep. I haven't told her about the rape of when my dad raped me when I was 6 years old. I've never shared that, but I'm afraid that my medical records are going to come out and everybody's going to know it. So they help prepare the client for the tough questions, the tough depositions. And there's no defense attorney out here that's nice. And you have to prepare them for the road ahead. And I can't, and any plaintiff's attorney can't, because we're not qualified to do that. It takes an expert in the field to work with you and guide them and help explain what it is that you're trying to accomplish so they can mentally prepare them for the journey they're about to take.
I think that's so true. Like we call it in the sort of pillars of trauma responsive practice, it's like the peer support or the collaboration, right? Like who's going to be the person to best build that individual feeling heard, seen, understood, so that they can then prepare. I like to think about this as like we are developing a safety plan for psychological safety. And those of us in the field, we're very familiar with like suicidal, ACT responses. We're familiar with how to respond. I think specifically around someone having suicidal ideations and like, how do we navigate that? And we're really good about physical safety planning, like who do I talk to in the court to make sure there's different spaces and like get through that. What we don't often think about is this concept of psychological safety planning, so that when they're in that stressful moment, they have those coping strategies, the grounding, finding a painting in the room, a person that they can look at to know where they are and feel safe. And I think for me, I like to think about this, someone else kind of taught me how to think about this way. And for folks that are comfortable, you can do this with me. If you close your eyes and you start to think about walking up a dark stairway and you have no idea like where the steps are, how big they are, how wide it is, what's at the top. But all of a sudden I start to describe that the steps are about 10 inches in depth. and there's only 10 of them. And when you get to the top, there's a little, as you go up, there's a little rail on your right-hand side, right about waist height. When you get to the top, if you reach out about a foot, there's going to be a switch and a light's going to be there. The second I start explaining to you what you can expect to come next, even if I can't guarantee it or promise it, but I can say, based on what I've seen before, these are the things that might likely happen. I start to feel safer and more prepared for that experience. And we say we can't guarantee, we can't promise, but here's what we can maybe expect based on what I've seen before. And we, just like Dawn's saying, we help prepare that client for the worst possible thing, right? We want them to be prepared for the worst possible thing to happen. And I think what this has really helped me as a practitioner think about having a trauma responsive practice, it is the concept of the forest for the trees, right? Because in our work, we're so used to thinking about the unique individual, what sort of barriers there are in obtaining their legal goals, the strategies we need to think about, how we're going to approach those things. But having a trauma-informed lens means we sort of take the focus we often have on individuals' behaviors and responses and how that's creating a challenge. And instead, that lens sharpens to help us start thinking about not what is wrong with this person, what is hard, but what happened. How do I better understand that? And how can I support them? Just like Dawn's saying, navigate how what has happened to them may potentially show up as a challenge in accessing their legal goals. For me, trauma-informed lawyering is really about moving away from that individual focus on the what is wrong to what has happened and how can I prepare to respond to that reality. I also think this concept of the forest for the trees is that we start to see ourselves as a part of the larger ecosystem of our clients' goals and needs, right? And what that means is once we know we are a part of this ecosystem, part of that psychological safety planning technique, preparing them, being prepared for those specific phases of a civil litigation process specifically means we have to also be taking care of ourselves. We have to be able to identify the places where we need to be building resiliency in ourselves and our teams so that we can be able to have these very hard, challenging, and even practice hard and challenging conversations and situations with clients that have these trauma histories. And so we broadly talk about this in our space as compassion fatigue. Some folks refer to it as vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. I think for me, one of the things that I like to think about is being in a helping profession where you are constantly in proximity to someone who's gone through maybe the most horrific experience of their life or had a very traumatic loss. It means taking some of that on as a helper. And this can show up in really unhealthy ways that we'll talk about sort of in the signs of how this presents in a way that is ultimately compassion fatigue. But it really comes from the fact that we're hearing the stories from our clients that have been really painful for them, that we're sometimes feeling like we can't solve their problems. Like I'm hardwired to be a solver of problems. And when I can't do that, I have a response. I have a reaction to that. Many of us are designed that way. It can come from just hearing these awful, awful things over and over again. And it can also come from feeling like we don't have the support we need to show up and do the best job. Ultimately, I think one thing that we have to be really conscious of is our own personal histories, our identities, and how that sometimes can be something that might make our own compassion fatigue more likely based on the systems and the structures that we are operating within. And I also think it's important for us as practitioners to know how compassion fatigue can present because it looks different, just like trauma, right? Like the presentation of compassion fatigue is unique to each individual. For me personally, I know that I'm having a challenge when I'm starting to sense a lack of purpose, right? Like finding purpose and meaning. And when I'm not feeling that is usually an indicator of this concept of compassion fatigue, but it shows up in people differently. You know, I've worked through people who it presents as almost like not being able to get enough. Like they want to listen to every trauma story. They want to see every hear every podcast and they almost need too much of it. It also shows up in people being sort of isolating and not wanting to engage and talk. And so all of these are ways that you might want to be conscious and aware that feeling or sensing one of these or multiple forms of these signs and symptoms can be an indicator that you're getting close to sort of the scales of burnout, which is when too much compassion fatigue is impacting our ability to fully show up and how we're doing our jobs. It's really interesting because there is research that was done, and a lot of people don't know about this. I find it pretty fascinating. So in the article, Jessica, if you want to share it over in the chat here, these researchers found that attorneys, they actually surveyed attorneys that were working with survivors of power-based violence and representing folks who were defendants in the criminal legal system. And so what they found of both of those practitioners, that they were actually more likely to experience vicarious trauma than social workers and mental health professionals. Right? Think about that. As lawyers, when we think about being in proximity to trauma, we are very, very, very closely tied to it, but we haven't always acknowledged that reality as a profession. And so for me, this means if you want to be a trauma-informed lawyer or legal professional, it is critical at the center of a client-centered practice that you have resilient teams. Right. And I know Dawn does. I know I've met her entire team, like we've honored them. Like part of it is you build an entire structure from start to finish that understands all of those principles, how to identify trauma, how to pivot when you see it, how to respond to it, how to minimize it. All of those folks involved in a client's experience have to have those tools and skills. And that means resiliency within the team. Because we know that compassion fatigue can show up in all these different layers of someone's life. That can be the physical, spiritual, mental, emotional, even our social interactions. That's what's really hard, both about trauma and compassion fatigue, is that the antidote, we've talked about this, is connection. But when you're feeling burnout, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling isolated and trusting relationships feels hard, the coping strategy is often to isolate. But the antidote to compassion fatigue trauma is being connected, feeling understood. And so it's almost this really dangerous feedback loop where we can often isolate away from support structures that are really the critical way that we get out of the problem of compassion fatigue. So building those support structures into systems and organizations is really important. We kind of have some tips up here, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the way you build a resilient team to take care of working with survivors who have either trauma, presentation of actual trauma, acute experiences that are part of the legal goal, or lived histories of trauma, dealing with things like racism daily, dealing with white supremacy and violence that comes from that. Those are living daily with both actual trauma experiences and the fear of perceived potential trauma. And so how do we build a structure that is going to support those realities, both for our staff and for our clients' lives? At the end of the day, it's about number 5. We have to build really toolboxes that maintain wellness. And I love to talk about these 6 different things. I see that Jessica's putting some of the key points in the chat here too. You know, for me, building and maintaining wellness is really about all of these different tools that speak to the components of our life: social, emotional, spiritual, physical, you know, and these are actually grounded in research that has shown this builds resiliency. These strategies make us have tools to deal with adversity, to deal with hard, challenging things in our life. And so the first one is mindfulness. I wish I meditated. I talk about it. I've read the research on how it actually helps you a lot. Meditation and mindfulness, breathing techniques have exponentially been shown in the data to allow people to get through those stressful moments, like preparing for a stressful experience like court, cross-examination, deposition, test, all of the examples that came up in the video. An attitude of gratitude. I love this one. We use it in our teams. Every staff meeting, we do a kudos, we do a recognition. There's real data to show that if you express gratitude regularly, that you actually build resiliency in how you deal with hard things. I do it with my toddlers. every night before we go to sleep, we say, what are 2 things that we are grateful for? Because I want to instill in them that building a sense of appreciation actually prepares you to deal with things that are really hard to feel good about, really hard to feel grateful for. Making moves, this is the one where we always cite, you see it come up in the video there. Having physical activity actually allows you to sleep better. It allows you to show up more fully. You're not tired. You're not as activated and agitated. I will also say there's interesting data that if you have to have a hard conversation, whether that's in your team or with a client, you are more likely to do that well if you're walking. Like, think about the reality of this in our world. Like, how many of us are working remotely? How easy is it when we have to have a really tough, hard conversation where we need to be really honest with someone about a hard piece of information we have to share? If we just say, hey, let's do this while we both go on a walk, or can we meet together and have this conversation while we're walking? It's an easy way to both sort of be I call it making the moves, but also to have hard conversations in a way that they're better received and we're able to be more honest. I don't know why that's true in the research, but it's interesting. We drive purposefulness. This actually creates resiliency in teams. So doing things like a thank bank, doing things like kudos, little moments of appreciation that are really authentic and meaningful actually build a sense of larger purpose for individuals in the larger team. Having really good social supports in place. For us, our team is taking off after Friday at noon because it's been a really hard couple of weeks. And just giving them a place to both process that experience and then say, I see you and I honor what you're doing and how hard this is. And I recognize that you might want some time to just take care of yourself. Those little tiny things create a fabric of social support from the organization and also among colleagues and peers. So those sorts of policies and approaches can be really helpful to building resiliency within a larger system. And then laughter. Laughter is a really big one. And sometimes we can use laughter as like a coping skill that's like more about minimizing or like, it's interesting how laughter really helps us build resiliency. I have a little thing that I'm going to show you all here, but it comes from this more recent research about laughter. There was this public policy statement that came out, and it was looking at social media content and the values and the sort of downsides of that. And what this research found is that when we look at memes, like those little like pictures of like and words that are like kind of funny and make fun of things, and I'm not describing them well, but when people looked at memes that made them laugh, it actually increased positive emotions. Not only that, but it has been found that memes actually are allowing people to better cope with the isolation of COVID-19. That was the specific focus of this particular study, that laughing and finding humor can allow us to build skills that keep us able to tackle really high stress in our lives. And that's the benefit of laughter and having the people that you can go to really find that. So in honoring that, I am sharing an actual meme that I made that probably no one will get, that cracks me up. So I saw this bumper sticker that said on the left here, this is a real bumper sticker that I saw. Tell your cat, I said, pss, 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 pss. And if anyone has a cat, you know what that means. So I actually said to my cat here, Mitty, pss, 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 and this is how she looked at me. And I thought this was hilarious. She was like, what are you doing? The point is, whatever it is that makes you laugh, part of building your resiliency in this work so you can show up with your mask on and take better care of your clients, find that thing that's going to give you joy, put people around you in your life that are going to also help you find that. I'm going to stop talking.
I want to add one thing if I can.
Yeah.
I think for the attorney and the client, managing expectations saves both parties.
So much.
You have victims that expect to get the world, but they don't understand that there's case law. There are things out there that even though they are a victim, they may not get the justice that they think that they deserve. And when you don't put that out there to them, you set yourself up as a lawyer where you feel really bad when things don't go right. And then you let them know, hey, I'm just a piece of this bigger circle that you spoke about. I'm not the judge. I'm not the jury. Like, I'm none of this. I'm just here for you. And when you set those boundaries in the beginning, you have a better client attorney relationship, and the expectation becomes more realistic. That's the biggest problem that I've ever noticed is that attorneys will tell them, oh, you'll get the world on this. But they know deep down they won't. And when it doesn't happen, you feel bad, and the client feels like I've exposed all of my deepest secrets to you. And what did we get? Our case was dismissed. Or what did we get? We got $50,000. Or what did we get? He didn't go to jail. It's so you have to manage expectations.
That is one
That's
of the
all I
most
would add to that. Is
No, I think it's so
your
critical,
client
Dawn.
expectations are managed and your expectations. And that way you guys can work together to get the best possible result, best result possible.
You know, it's such a good way to bring it full circle on like, how do we take care of ourselves and our clients, right? Because when we say all the time, like being kind is being honest about our limitations, not making promises we can't keep, being clear about our roles, right? And I often find with lawyers, I'm going to stop the share so we can just see each other here too. I often find with lawyers, we are sometimes really hard. We find it hard to deliver the bad news. And we often also find it hard at the front end to be clear about the places where we might encounter bad news, right? But you're absolutely right, Dawn, that the more clear we are in expectation management on the front end, the more likely we are for that client to feel like we are trusted. We did what was expected. We were clear about what they could potentially expect, what we could and could not do. And then also, we don't feel that heavy burden of not being able to accomplish something that we should have been able to when we have been clear up the front what we can and what we can't accomplish in those client goals. I think that's such a good point. I need to give the CLE code. I'm getting a little nudge that folks want to get that. So Jessica, I'm going to announce it. If you could also put it in the chat for folks that are getting the 1 hour CLE today. Our code for the day is NVR 526. So Network for Victim Recovery, NVR 526, today's date. Thank you so much, Jessica. I put our contact information up here on the slide. And Jessica, if you want to pop any of that also into the chat for folks that want to reach out to me or Dawn. Dawn and I are in touch. We know where to find each other, but I just want to say a special thanks to the folks that have joined us today, but also who joined us multiple times throughout this series. It's really been an honor and a privilege being a part of how we can just do a little bit to hopefully make the important jobs you do, representing so many survivors, so many having, you know, that wouldn't necessarily have access to justice without you. Thank you for what you do. I hope that we've been able to add some tools to your toolbox. Thank you, Dawn, for giving us your time and energy today and being such a great partner in this work. I really appreciate what you do for survivors in our region, and I'm just really grateful for everyone's time and attention.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to work with you.
Yeah, and I'm cheering for your daughter on the track. Woo woo! I hope she's doing well. And also, Jessica went ahead, put the code there in the chat. Remember, you have to submit those 2 forms, the attorney form, and also include that code, and also go ahead and submit back to Jessica Sanchez, whose email's in the chat there, the review or the assessment of today as well, in addition with that form. Again, thank you, everyone. You know where to find us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a very restorative week and weekend. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Dawn. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jessica. Thanks, Jennifer, Anna, and team behind the scenes. Be well, do good work.